Welcome everyone to the opening session of our digital conference, Queer Feminist Perspectives on Political Homophobia and Anti-Feminism in the Middle East and Europe. The conference is organized by Humboldt University of Berlin, Brown University, and the Heinrich Böll Stiftung. My name is Tunay Altay. I'm a PhD researcher in sociology at Humboldt University of Berlin and one of the co-organizers of today's event. In this opening session, I'm joined by my co-organizers, Gökçe Yurdakul, Katharina Galor, and Nadje Al-Ali. I would like to start off by saying a few words about today's event. Queer Feminist Perspectives Conference is aimed to offer a cross-regional and interdisciplinary platform for scholars, artists, researchers, and activists to discuss the emerging issues of gender and sexuality in the Middle East and Europe. We dedicated this year's conference to the far-right movements, authoritarianism and populism, and how they instrumentalize homophobia and anti-feminism to mobilize in the Middle East and Europe. Teasing the epistemological boundaries set between these two regions, our conference ventures into creating a critical dialogue that builds on the contextual and geographical complexities, the impacts of Europeanization, immigration, globalization, racism, and the histories of colonialism and imperialism connecting these two regions. In this respect, our participants' work engage with a multitude of subjects: Iran's monarchist and nationalist discourse, Ukraine's sex education debate, the place of gender and sexuality in far-right Israeli politics, and anti-gender and anti-feminist mobilization in Turkey and Poland are only some of the topics that we will cover in our conference. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic also played a major role in the planning of this event. As a crisis that shaped the political project of the far-right globally, COVID-19 has shown how intersectional systems of oppression are reproduced and even further intensified while immigrants, women, LGBTQ, and other minority groups were being targeted and demonized in various contexts. In these 2 days, we will talk about systemic inequalities, discrimination, marginalization, and political exclusion of communities whose lives are affected by what some call the resurgence of far-right movements globally. Thinking through contextual entanglements between theory, activism, and art, we are hoping that these 2 days will lead to further research and writing in which we can collectively imagine queer feminist makings of new potentials and possibilities. With this note, I will now pass the mic to my co-organizer, Nadje Al-Ali, for her introduction.
Thanks so much, Tunay. So I'm Nadje Al-Ali. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown, where I'm also professor of anthropology and Middle East studies. And I'm really, really excited to be part of this effort. And I'm really particularly thankful to Tunay, and Gökçe, who approached my colleague, Katharina Galor, and myself here at Brown. And, I guess often we sort of in feminist circles speak about the importance of process, but I definitely feel that as much as I'm excited about the conference, also the process of organizing this and getting to know the team and thinking these issues through has been really important. And seeing on Monday, we had a meeting with some of the contributors, and it was extremely rewarding to see how various people from various regions, especially Eastern Europe and the Middle East, actually appreciated the opportunity to be in conversation with each other. And that's really one of the big goals of this effort, is to de-exceptionalize, particularly the Middle East. I mean, it's still very much the case that, when we think about homophobia, when we think about gender-based oppression, there is, this focus on the Middle East, while clearly these days, one of the things that has become more and more apparent is, we can't think in terms of the old categories anymore, the East and the West and the North and the South, especially when it comes to right-wing movements and the anti-gender and anti-feminist discourses, as well as rising homophobia. So in the Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown, I have been trying more broadly to center gender and sexuality in trying to understand broader developments in the region. And I think what this conference will show is that if you want to understand authoritarianism, if you want to understand the rising right-wing movements and discourses, we can't sideline our discussions and understanding of gender issues and also discourses and policies linked to sexuality. These are at the very center of what we see happening more broadly. So yeah, I think with this, I don't want to take too much time, and I'm going to now hand over to my colleague, Katharina Galor, who is also going to say a few words and introduce herself. Thank you.
So I would like to add my words of enthusiasm for this conference and my words of gratitude to all of our participants, without whose presence and contributions this event would not be happening. And I would like to reiterate what my colleagues have already stated, which is that as we have read the abstracts and papers that the participants have shared with us, the commonalities, overlaps, the parallels have really been astounding. And to some extent, it is, of course, what we anticipated as we thought of this meeting and as we put together the program. But the similarities across the countries and regions we're examining have really by far exceeded our expectations. And to build on my colleagues Tunay's and Nadje's point about de-exceptionalizing the Middle East in regard to discourses on and legislation of anti-feminist and homophobic sentiments, movements and policies, I would like to add some concrete examples from my own field of expertise. One is Israel's global political alliances with other countries on the far right spectrum of political leadership, such as Poland, Hungary, and Brazil, that on the surface are about shared economic, military, and social interests, which, however, when examined more carefully, seem to promote very similar conservative, anti-democratic, discriminatory, and racist views, including openly anti-feminist and homophobic trends and policies. And another example would be Germany and France, Europe's leading powers considered models in the defense of democratic values and human rights, yet who in recent years have tolerated, if not embraced, policies and political parties that promote anti-feminist and homophobic discourses and movements. And perhaps one more comment on our participants in this conference, those who are here in this virtual space and those who cannot be with us. As we prepared this meeting, and also when we met last Monday for a pre-conference workshop, I was struck by the differences in positionality. While we're all deeply committed to and invested in combating anti-feminist and homophobic expressions and realities, whether as activists or scholars, some of us are more privileged and secure than others. Some live under occupation, others in hiding and exile, in discriminatory contexts, under physical and legal threat. And finally, there are those who we're hoping to share with us their work who actually could not be here with us today for reasons of safety. And I feel it is important to keep this in mind as we gather here in this virtual space and engaging topics that are important to us, debates that will hopefully contribute, even if only modestly, to shape a better future for all. And I almost forgot, I'm Katharina Galor. I'm a senior lecturer in Judaic Studies at Brown University. I'm trained as an art historian, an archaeologist working primarily in Israel, Palestine, and also more recently in Germany with an interest in cultural heritage, religious politics, and gender. And I'm delighted to be a co-organizer and participant in this really amazing conference. Thank you.
Now it's Gökçe. Would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Yes, thank you to the organizing team. My name is Gökçe Yurdakul. I'm the director of Institute for Social Sciences at the Humboldt University of Berlin. And I'm also a professor of sociology at the Department of Diversity and Social Conflict and Berlin Institute of Migration and Integration Research. After these three very interesting interventions, I want to focus on a specific theme that came a lot during our conversations, and that's what's happening in the universities. And this is the place that I am located right now, my office at the Humboldt University. Universities are not places of study, but also places of political movements. Without transformative power of politics, the study in the university does not have a meaning. Let me give three examples from the universities that our participants are coming today. Due to the modifications of Hungary's law on higher education, Central European University was not able to operate legally in Hungary and moved its US accredited programs to Austria, specifically gender studies department, which I had the honor to be in the accreditation process. It was a target of conservative politics in Hungary. It was banned in Hungarian university education, and the whole program had to be carried to Vienna. A second example comes from Turkey, which is my alma mater and also Tunay's alma mater. The university affiliates who named themselves as Academics for Peace were dismissed from their academic position and fled to European and North American countries. They had to convince media that they are not refugees, but scholars at risk, and some of them are among us today. Still struggling to find places for themselves in a new academic system, their careers are results of politics that demonizes universities and in being intellectuals. More recently, the renowned Boğaziçi University had to politically struggle for months to overthrow a university president who was appointed top-down by the government. An LGBTQI+ flag was repeatedly shown in the media as a symbol of freedoms. A third example comes from Poland. In 2020, the education minister Czarnek said that the funding may be cut to the universities that facilitated university affiliates to participate in pro-abortion protests. University academics in Poland are protesting Czarnek, saying that LGBTQ people are not equal to normal people. Things are not better in German universities. In my own conversations in various meetings, I have to repeatedly justify the significance of gender and diversity related to research and teaching for securing freedoms in my own university. In fact, little has been said in the current election campaign in Germany, which will take place on Sunday, about securing freedoms and the difficult situation in German universities with limited staff, constant push for university staff to bring external funding, and lack of perspective for early career researchers. These are some of the themes that makes this conference so important. In the umbrella term of queer feminist perspectives, one of the issues that brings us here today is to talk about how we critique anti-democratic and authoritarian governments in order to secure freedoms in the universities in a global context. So I am very happy to be with you here, and I am looking forward to the excellent papers that we will discuss in the next 2 days. I'm giving the word to Nadje Al-Ali to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you very much, Gökçe. Yeah, I mean, I'm so excited and happy that I'm able to introduce Professor Deniz Kandiyoti to you all. Before I'm going to give the more official version, I say I'm particularly excited and happy because I feel that I owe a lot to Deniz, who was not only my PhD supervisor, but has continued to be a mentor and friend. And I'm very much indebted to her scholarship and her thinking that's often controversial, that's often pushing boundaries. Sometimes we don't agree, but she always makes me think. So Deniz Kandiyoti is Emeritus Professor of Development Studies at SOAS, formerly known as the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. She holds degrees from the University of Paris, Sorbonne, and the London School of Economics and Political Science, LSE. She was also on the faculty of Middle East Technical University from 1969 to 74 and Bogazici University in Turkey. She has worked on Turkey, post-Soviet Central Asia, and Afghanistan. And I should say, you know, if you're interested in contemporary situation in Afghanistan, I strongly urge you to read her work on Afghanistan. She has developed comparative perspectives on state, gender, and power in the broader Muslim world. Deniz has made key theoretical contributions to analysis of patriarchy and male dominance. She is the author of numerous articles that, I mean, if you teach a course on the Middle East, a course on gender in the Middle East, her articles have to be on the syllabus. She's the author of Concubines, Sisters and Citizens, Identities and Social Transformations, the editor of Fragments of Culture, the Everyday of Modern Turkey, Gendering the Middle East, the Path-Breaking Woman, Islam and the State in 1991, and more recently, jointly with my colleague and friend Catherine Spellman-Poots and myself, Gender, Governance and Islam, which is an edited volume and builds on women, Islam and the State. Deniz has also acted as consultant for UN Women, UNDP, UNESCO, many other organizations, and monitored the gender effects of the Arab uprisings from 2011 as guest editor for 50/50 in Open Democracy. So it's my great pleasure to now welcome Deniz to give her keynote. Thanks, Deniz, and welcome.
Thank you, Nadja. After such an introduction, it can only go downhill, I imagine. What I would like to start my presentation with is by taking you on a guided tour of selected vignettes that I believe illustrate some of the conundrums of my title. This past June, Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte declared that Hungary, and I quote, has no business being in the European Union anymore after it passed legislation banning LGBTQ content in schools and the media. Admittedly, this came at the tail end of a decade of systematic democratic backsliding. The MIT economist Daron Acemoğlu argued forcefully that the European Union should begin the process of expelling Hungary and to start considering doing the same to Poland, which is set on a similar course, lest it makes a mockery of the European project and everything it stands for. Considering that support for populist parties has roughly doubled across Europe in recent decades, this obviously opens a hornet's nest of thorny issues. Earlier on, I was struck by an article titled Sex, Violence and the Rise of Populism, published in the Financial Times in 2018, precisely because it appeared in a publication that does not ordinarily deal with gender issues. It noted the militantly misogynistic tone of populist movements in the United States, Brazil, the Philippines, and Italy, among others, referring to outrageous statements made by a variety of leaders such as Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil, Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines, Matteo Salvini, a dominant figure in the Italian government of the time, and of course, ex-US President Donald Trump. Images of a bare-chested, horse-riding Vladimir Putin, the patron saint of state-sponsored homophobia, and jibes about rape and assorted sexual slurs started appearing in the political rhetoric of male leaders and were regularly reported in the popular press. Even scholars of populism with little previous interest in gender issues started taking note of this strongly gendered discourse and its blatant appeal to a frail masculinity threatened, as Kasmode puts it, by emasculating feminists, effeminate liberals, or overly virile others, such as Blacks or immigrants. We now find ourselves in a 21st century assailed by the spectacle of deeply polarized societies across the globe, where what is at stake are vital issues such as our understandings of citizenship, national belonging, and the future of the polity. Co-citizens gaze at each other with mistrust and sometimes revulsion across chasms that have often been willfully cultivated by leaders hankering after unchecked executive power. In the conflict-torn societies of the Middle East and North Africa region that have been victims of multiple foreign interventions, sectarian divides are weaponized with deadly consequences that feed flows of refugees and migrants, further entrenching xenophobic and exclusionary rhetoric in the receiving countries. A recent addition to this dismal landscape was the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan. You might all recall that the invocation of abused women in Afghanistan and later on in Iraq, both as a prelude and an accompaniment to US military intervention in the context of the so-called war on terror, had produced the effect of equating feminism with imperialism. Far from inspiring an unqualified response of international feminist solidarity, these invocations provoked sharp critical reactions from many feminists in the North and beyond. Moreover, the designation of these interventions as cultural imperialism had the unintended side effect of locking the women of Afghanistan into an essentialized concept of cultural indigeneity, reinscribing the categories of the Muslim woman versus the West. Yet, as Edward Said reminded us in his lecture that refuted Huntington's thesis, he said there are no insulated cultures or civilizations. Any attempt made to separate them into watertight compartments does damage to their variety, their diversity, their sheer complexity, their radical hybridity. Afghanistan, I found out, was no exception. Let us be quite clear that just as there are Afghan women dreaming of becoming doctors and lawyers, or of joining football and cricket teams, a recent study indicates that some of their urban and educated contemporaries find the Taliban's Islam insufficiently rigorous and aspire to become members of the Islamic State Khorasan province. One of the more disturbing features of the analyses that followed the current Taliban takeover, almost a generation later, is that the terms of the debate have hardly shifted. While some analysts have celebrated the victory of the Taliban as the definitive defeat of US imperialism, others have declared the end of an alleged era of progress and freedom for Afghan women. The casualty has, as usual, been a serious analysis of how the dysfunctions of US intervention, its counterinsurgency-led disregard for civilian lives, and built-in corruption prepared its own demise, and why the type of regime ushered in by the Taliban falls far short of representing the society it purports to be in control of. Yet, whether through pragmatism, opportunism, or conviction, accommodations to a new normal abound. Canada's Minister for Women and Gender Equality, an Afghan herself, raised many eyebrows when she referred to the Taliban as our brothers, in a plea, no doubt, to ensure safe passage for thousands of fleeing Afghans. A declaration from the United Nations Office of the Commissioner of Human Rights, penned by the Special Rapporteur for Violence Against Women, admonished the Taliban for overlooking the distinction between Sharia, eternal ethical principles, and fiqh, the Islamic legal tradition that is open to interpretation and modification, thus ceding that a correct interpretation of Islamic law is the sole basis for defining gender equality or women's citizenship rights. Yet, among 50 Muslim majority countries across the world, only 18 have constitutions based on Sharia law, and 10 have declared Islam as the official state religion without making any direct reference to Sharia. Finally, the exhortations of the United Arab Emirates for the Taliban to adopt a more moderate line on women's rights cannot but ring hollow, coming from a polity that practices a guardianship or walaya system that reduces women to being legal minors. I conclude my brief tour of varied gendered landscapes with the sense that the term chasm I used in relation to the polarizing culture wars of the North almost calls for the metaphor of separate galaxies when we move to a more global scale. Is there any hope of finding a mutually intelligible language for claim making and voice in a world where most women and men are locked into coerced identities, while feminists in the North are engaged in sometimes acrimonious debates over identities, bodies, and sexualities? Social movements and their demands are always grounded in local histories of struggle, regardless of the global veneer of movements for gender equality and LGBTQ rights. How do we deal with differences in language, meaning, and temporality among them? In lieu of an answer which I do not possess, but I hope your deliberations will help to address, I propose today to revisit a number of key milestones on the road leading to our current predicament. One of the most widely used frameworks to define our moment centers around the concept of backlash. This concept implies resistance by those who feel threatened by changes to the status quo and reactions to a perceived loss of power when marginalized or disadvantaged groups challenge existing power structures. In historical terms, the extension of recognition, voice, and rights to colonial subjects, laboring masses, women, people of color, and non-normative sexualities throughout the 20th century has arguably galvanized aggrieved majorities, rallying around slogans laden with moral panic, such as the end of white Christian America or the death of the family. Furthermore, backlash may have transnational, regional, and subnational manifestations. It is good to keep in mind that there are now powerful transnational alliances cutting across continents and world religions, aiming above all to establish the principle that matters relating to sexuality, reproductive choice, and the control of bodies do not belong to the sphere of civic deliberation, public choice, or human rights, but to a domain of non-negotiable doctrinal and cultural imperatives. A multi-sited project titled Countering Backlash, coordinated by the Institute of Development Studies in the United Kingdom, to which I participate in a minor way by being an advisor, is engaged in developing frameworks to make sense of these changes. And I invite you to visit their website, IDS Countering Backlash. Their work suggests that we are dealing with at least 3 different types of phenomena. The first type centers around defensive responses that are reactive in nature and restorative in intent. Examples may be found in men's movements, such as fathers' protests against alimony and custody arrangements that they feel favor women. Such movements are relatively new to the Middle East, but may be found in several countries, such as Egypt, where even relatively minor reforms to existing divorce laws have triggered sharp reactions. The same applies to Turkey, where reactive men's movement is in progress, with, I may add, a lot of female followers. The second type of reaction is offensive, and it makes reference to a paradise lost of patriarchal gender harmony or complementarity, using diverse tropes such as pre-colonial, indigenous, Islamic Golden Age, Christian, or other pre-Lapsarian scripts. At the most extreme end of the offensive continuum, we find movements for male entitlement, such as the so-called incels, or involuntary celibates, who, as you know, resort to violence and sometimes terrorism. Finally, we find opportunistic alliances of actors with diverse agendas who strategically deploy anti-gender ideology as a glue to rally their socially conservative bases. An excellent example of such instrumentalism is provided by Turkey, that was among the first signatories of the Council of Europe's Istanbul Convention to combat violence against women, which became effective in August 1st, 2014. It was also the first and only country to withdraw on 1 July 2021, despite extensive protests, as a result of bargains struck with ultra-conservative Jamaats and the fundamentalist party, which is insignificant in electoral terms, at a point in time when the AKP's popularity was waning and was trying to make an appeal to its pious base. Now, theories of backlash raise the question of whether there are tipping points whereby gradual shifts eventually result in more visible and threatening qualitative changes. Whereas the presence of token minorities might have created little unease at a point when they were not seen as a threat to established orders, the critical mass represented by grassroots movements such as Me Too or Black Lives Matter may constitute a new threshold. These are all important issues that merit further discussion. But my own reading of our moment stretches somewhat beyond the concept of backlash, since I feel that we also need to account for the fault lines running within feminisms and gender identity debates, and not just types of resistance outside it. This calls for an examination of the internal contradictions and unintended consequences of a series of global encounters which have had major implications for rights advocacy in the global South. For those of you who are unfamiliar with my arguments, I shall briefly recapitulate these. The first is the encounter with the global institutionalization of standards and mechanisms for gender equality through the workings of the United Nations, its agencies, and the major international donors. There are multiple excellent accounts, some of the most incisive authored by Latin American scholars, of the diverse ways in which women's movements became depoliticized through cooptation by donor-assistant governments and their ecosystems of NGOs. In the Middle East and North Africa region, jumping on the gender bandwagon became a soft option used by numerous authoritarian regimes to indicate their commitment to a democratization process they had no intention of honoring. I had mentioned Turkey earlier as an exemplar of the instrumentalization of gender equality concerns, but there is a long, long line of governments in the Middle East using exactly the same techniques. The same logic applies to other attempts to co-opt liberal norms in the domain of gender and sexuality, such as pinkwashing Israel to burnish its democratic credentials, regardless of the human rights abuses perpetrated against Palestinians, or the fact that it is dominated by homophobic religious fundamentalist parties as never before. The second ill-fated encounter took place after the global turn to neoliberalism since the Reagan-Thatcher era. The objectives of women's movements, many of which were explicitly committed to social justice and redistributed goals, were now transformed into technocratic fixes for the empowerment of women within the parameters of a neoliberal market economy. In the West, this gave rise to a triumphalist boardroom or corporatist feminism, extolling the virtues of capitalist markets for women who make it. In the South, meanwhile, the spaces left vacant by the dearth of social services and social welfare were occupied by actors and social movements with conservative agendas and roots in faith-based organizations, whether these be Catholic, evangelical, or Muslim. Populist and religious movements claiming to speak on behalf of the poor, the marginalized, and the powerless in different regional contexts increased their appeal, regardless of the often authoritarian or dogmatic messages that they were putting out. Losing sight of the fact that feminism cannot be divorced from a broader social justice agenda was to exact heavy costs, among which was the trivialization of their concerns as the preoccupations of a privileged elite. By the time I started working in Afghanistan in the early 2000s, gender mainstreaming was well established. I identified at the time the top-down dissemination of new gender norms as a form of donor-driven gender activism that necessitated a new technical vocabulary and tools that were as yet unfamiliar to local women's rights activists. The shift from women to gender that took place over the successive United Nations decades for women between the 1970s and the 1990s eventually led to a bifurcation between the social relations approach prevalent in gender analysis frameworks that were used in development context and the postmodern critical theory inspired corpus of scholarship that became canonical in Northern academia. Queer studies, which is an offshoot of this latter strand, distinguished itself through its incisive focus on biopolitics and an expansive analysis of normalizing regimes that also include the liberal logic of sexual minority politics in the West. This brings me to the final and possibly most devastating encounter, which took place in the geopolitical context of the war on terror from the 9/11 events onwards. As I pointed out earlier, the invocation of oppressed Muslim women as part of the rationale for military intervention in Afghanistan and beyond had provoked predictable outrage in the face of its naked instrumentalism. This resulted in a cottage industry of critiques of feminism as imperialism and of gender equality norms as tools in this arsenal of oppression, designated by some, by the way, as governance feminism. The same logic was applied to the area of LGBTQ rights by scholars locating imperial justifications for war in the Middle East in so-called homo-nationalist discourses that present Islam as inherently intolerant and violent, as the very antithesis of an allegedly liberal West. This, I argue, has led us to a new epistemic cul-de-sac. Are there any ways of critiquing US imperialism and Western hegemony without becoming entrapped yet again in the sterile binaries of East versus West, tradition versus modernity, secularism versus Islam? How to avoid demonizing and marginalizing rights actors who fall foul of some implicit sanctioned notion of indigeneity? These are crucial questions which I am not proposing to address here, but I would like to direct you instead to a forthcoming event at the Center of Near and Middle East Studies on September 29th by Evren Savcı, who discusses our book titled Queer in Translation, where she addresses these very issues that I have just skillfully dodged. To conclude, the gender wars of my title are the product of both external onslaughts that crystallize around so-called anti-gender ideology, which manifests itself in familiar ways across the globe, and also of the contradictions and dysfunctions that are internal to platforms claiming to have a feminist agenda. The challenge before us is to find the imagination and wisdom to forge a new politics of feminist solidarity that resonates across the globe by harnessing the aspirations of younger generations whose anti-authoritarian impulses were on display in the streets of Cairo, Istanbul, Tunis, and Tehran, and not just San Francisco, Madrid, or Warsaw. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Deniz, for this talk. A lot in there. And I forgot to mention that we have some time for discussion. So I encourage people to put their comments and questions. And I see there are already a couple. Before I open it up, I just wanted to follow up on one strand of your talk, because I know that many of people in the audience will have read your earlier work, in which you, particularly bargaining with patriarchy, which has become such a sort of classic and people refer to and try to apply to in different contexts. But I know that your thinking has changed quite radically around that. And that's one thing, that I really appreciate about you and Deniz, the sort of, you're actually moving and changing, and also sometimes pausing and saying, well, maybe, I was thinking it at this time, but I now changed my mind. So could you just maybe for a few minutes sort of share that shift in terms of your thinking around patriarchy? I mean, when you're speaking about backlash, of course, what comes into mind is your concept of masculinist restoration. How have you moved from the idea of the patriarchal bargain and, you'd already kind of 10 years later kind of reconceptualized that to saying, well, I don't know that patriarchy still really works for me. And can you just say a little bit about that? And then I'll move to the questions.
Because I adopted, Nadja, a rather strict definition of patriarchy. I think that it is distinct from systems of male dominance because it also involved intergenerational relations between men, patriarchy, in the sense I understood it, which broke down quite substantially and wholesale. So that I had to sort of reorient myself to defining polities where male dominance was being kept alive, as it were, through laws, through on the street by the state, while the material basis of what I used to define as patriarchy had collapsed substantially. Therefore, I had to redefine the politics of this new phase as masculinist restoration, because I no longer consider that male dominance is hegemonic. That is why so much effort is being expended at all levels in maintaining this order, and also why it has become so intimately intermeshed with types of governments. In other words, all types of authoritarian governments also presume a particular type of gender order. It seems to come, as a package deal. Wherever you see it, I mean, recently you might have read interventions in China banning sissy boys from television. So there is a sort of generalized, I mean, one could catalog these, and have little cases, but there is a clear, and this is probably not new, because I also found historical pronouncements, that I didn't use because I had a short time, that indicate that this is a form of politics. Essentially, what I have been struggling to do, Nadja, is to decouple these discussions, especially in the Middle East, from culturalist interpretations, and to bring them squarely into the domain of politics.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yes. I have to say, I was very happy that you pointed to the event Queer in Translation, because I just read the book and, I'll be in conversation with Evan, and I thought it was fantastic. And particularly fantastic because I think sort of similar also with, your work, you make sure to ground your arguments in political economy. And challenge the idea of this culturalization. Everything is up to its Islam, its Middle East culture, and Evan does the same when she's speaking about. I mean, in terms of, she's very much sort of linking the specifics of neoliberal Islam and looking at political economy. So but let me move to the questions, and I just also like to remind the audience, aside from you being able to put your questions and comments in the Q&A function, that we will, after the keynote, we'll have a musical performance, a recorded musical performance, as well as the opening panel on the same link. So, stay with us. The first question is by Ethan Bonali, who says, I wanted to congratulate you on the very high level of this webinar. I would like to ask a question about femonationalism. That is, that part of feminism that cooperates with white supremacism and patriarchy. In Italy, far-right parties are using the voice of some TERFs, such as Marina Terragni, presented as feminists, to defeat the approval of a law to protect LGBT people. I wanted to ask you if you have observed the same phenomenon in other countries. Thanks for the reply.
Well, I am a little bit puzzled by the choice of feminism to designate women who uphold white supremacism and patriarchy. Okay, this is the sort of conundrum. I think that unfortunately, and there is a sort of perversion of arguments going on there, which is a domain that really I don't want to venture into. I think that the whole discussion on trans rights and so on has become so convoluted that it is possible to make outrageous parallels. Like, I don't know the person you're talking about, but basically, you know, calling that position a feminist position really rather stretches the imagination, I find. So we have to, you know, really, by the way, though, in answer to that question, let me make very clear at the outset that there is absolutely no way that you can read off political positions from sexualities or from sexual orientations. All you have to do is look at the trans persona of the abortion banning far-right Republican Caitlyn Jenner to convince yourself that there isn't any great mileage in trying to find homologies between identities and politics. That I think I want to be very clear about. And this is also the case with, you know, prominent gay Dutch politicians who are openly racist, etc. So I think that this is a line. Maybe I haven't emphasized it in my talk, but I want to make that absolutely clear.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Deniz. The second question is by Mengia Chaler. How do you think can activists and organizers best support and collaborate with LGBTQI and women's organizations located in Eastern Europe? And how can we best form solidarity networks with Eastern European organizations working with LGBTQI persons?
Unfortunately, I know so little about the Eastern European context that I would feel like a total fraud, you know, making any recommendations about a context I know very little about. I personally think that the problem cannot be resolved by attacking it at the level of the issue of LGBTQI rights, but at the level of governance. I mean, I was amazed to find out that as far as Poland is concerned, the Catholic Church is practically in the same relationship as the clergy in Iran, as far as influencing parliament, as far as legislation and so on. Now, without breaking that stranglehold in the same way that in the Islamic Republic of Iran, whatever the citizens' aspirations, as long as the system remains unchanged, you can never have democratic elections. You have a similar problem. So I think that LGBTQI activists should join whatever broader movement exists to shift the existing governance structures, or no amount of transnational solidarity is going to help them out. That's what I think.
Yeah, well, I think that actually Turkey is probably the example par excellence, where you have feminist and LGBTQI activists who are at the forefront of challenging authoritarianism, right? I mean, that's and actually are maybe the only people left who are, you know, challenging it outwardly, which is quite amazing. But I've noticed also in Lebanon that queer feminist activists, you know, they're are very concerned about linking their political struggle to issues around, well, challenging sectarianism, challenging political authoritarianism, corruption, as well as working with domestic workers in Lebanon. So I find that certainly in the Middle East, much of queer feminist activists, not necessarily the more sort of liberal LGBT activism, is very much linking their struggle to a range of different issues. Denise, I was, okay, I see there are some more questions. Okay, here, question from Busta Sati. Why do you think anti-feminist ideology take more physically violent forms in Turkey, especially within the family?
As compared to what? I mean, I think it's pretty violent in Mexico as well. And I think there are my own interpretation of the Turkish case has been really that there is a great deal to fight for. Unlike many countries in the Middle East, where family laws, etc., are really stacked up, you know, against women. In Turkey, there are two phenomena. First of all, the legislation is still holding. I mean, there's been an onslaught going on against the Civic Law of 2001 and the Criminal Code Amendment of 2004, but still on the statute books, there's a lot to fight for. Another, and this is my hypothesis, is that there is now a huge gap between generations of men and women in Turkey. There is a new generation of women who've achieved education, who've achieved mobility and so on, who are with a generation of men, except the very younger ones, whose expectations have not been equally modified. And what I find interesting as a finding in Turkey, there is a very important NGO called the Platform to Prevent Femicides. And what they note is that it is not necessarily women who are not earning or are disempowered who are most subjected to violence, but women who resist. Women who want a divorce, who their partner doesn't want to divorce, daughters who don't want to obey brothers or fathers, and so on. So I think that at the moment, the gender situation in Turkey is a perfect storm, in the sense that there is a great deal of resistance, and the backlash comes in the form of violence and coercion. I mean, this is to be tested, obviously, but that's my hunch about Turkey. Mm-hmm. Women will simply not submit, and they do it openly. Yeah. You know, there is defiance. Yes. Open, and not just in the big cities. Yeah. This is the thing.
Yeah.
This started, in fact, years ago when the victims of violence, you know that in Muslim funerals, women do not lift coffins. They don't go to the grave. It's segregated. Years ago, Turkish women started taking the funerals of women victims of violence, which is a huge form of protest. Yeah. And the breaking of a taboo as well.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me move to Rita Brata-Droy's question. I wanted to ask if, in view of these recent developments regarding LGBTQI violence, does the definition of patriarchy change in terms of bringing this violence within its fold? If so, how?
Not necessarily, in the sense that, as I said earlier, you know, there is one particular definition, you know, of hegemonic dominance, which consists in asserting control over bodies, sexualities, and persons. To the extent that the LGBTI phenomenon is part of infractions in that domain, you do not need a separate concept to describe forms of oppression directed at LGBTQI. Not that I use the same, it fits within my transformed conception of patriarchy. Mm-hmm. I don't, as you know, use the term patriarchy as such, but my patriarchy 2.1, or, you know, new version accommodates the oppression of LGBTQI individuals within the same umbrella. You don't need a separate definition of it.
Maybe just to clarify, because I don't think that maybe people are not familiar, can you just elaborate a little bit on this sort of I mean, we talked about it a bit, but I think that probably the audience would benefit from a clarification.
Okay. It comes from the fact that patriarchy was never about only the dominance of men over women, okay? that is not, you know, how it works. Initially, it was about literally the patriarchal domination of male in power holding positions, usually of the older generation, controlling the property, mobility, marital prospects, and sexualities of the younger generation, men and women. To that extent, I always explained in my own work the pro-feminist leanings of the early Middle East reformers as a reaction to the type of governance and the type of patriarchy they had in their households. Okay, so that is what I mean when I say we don't need a new definition of patriarchy. For that, I refer you to an article I wrote ages ago called "The Paradoxes of Masculinity," which was in a book edited by Nancy Lindisfarne and Andrea Cornwall.
Yeah. Thanks. So maybe I'm going to take a couple of questions, Denise. One by Victoria Shire. How can we shift the cultural discourse of Islamic culture versus Western culture towards a rather political economy analysis methodologically in academic research? Right, so that's the first one. And then Nur Sinem Kuru, thank you for that great speech. My question is about women's participation in politics and voting choices in Turkey. How should we understand and interpret women in AKP as party members and voters? Right. So the first question about the shift from cultural discourse towards political economy, and the second one more specifically about women in the AKP.
I'm quite desperate about the first one because I really don't think we can. If you look at the analyses following the Taliban takeover, you would think that no research is done as nothing happened in the 20 years intervening, okay? I think that it is now too entrenched and useful a tool, facile though it is. That is why it keeps coming back, and we don't seem to be able to get rid of it. I don't know the answer to that. All my professional life, I really tried very hard to complicate the picture and to show all the other layers intervening that actually make a culturalist interpretation extremely narrow and practically useless. Was it a success? I think not. Okay, so one keeps going. As for Nur, thank you. This is my favorite question. Because Nur asked me about how we understand the female followership of the AKP, which is a very important question because there was a particular point where there were more female voters than male. In fact, 52% of women, as opposed to 48% men, something like that, who voted for the AKP. And my answer is in two parts. First, politics, like all regimes, the AKP also had its female beneficiaries. These are the women of the ruling entourage who exist everywhere. They exist in the Soviet Union, they exist in Iran, they exist in Saudi Arabia, and so on, you know? These are the women who are the beneficiaries of the positions, the businesses, the media, etc., created being part of the ruling clique. What is more interesting for me is the majority of women who are from the popular classes. And there I think the answer is simply that the AKP has been extremely successful in providing welfare and other services at the neighborhood level through municipalities, answering to the needs of these women who are, many of them, recent rural to urban migrants, and who were included in the politics through what I call citizenship as entitlement. They became, for the first time, bearers of rights in their persons, not least because the welfare help given to women was directed at women. The cash transfers were not given to the male heads of households, but just like these programs in Latin America and elsewhere, they were given to women. Now, how is it that these women were voting for the AKP at the same moment that at another level the government was trying to claw back on women's rights in Turkey? That was actually my return to the patriarchal bargain, if you like. In the same way that women sought protection in households under patriarchal arrangements, these women were accepting the deal of being women as the AKP wanted them to be, against the advantages of participating in this grassroots, which, by the way, was very emancipatory. Women were given literacy classes, they got help with their children at school, and so forth. So I think that, you know, between these two phenomena, there is, to me, no surprise at all. However, I'm not sure that this is continuing successfully. Paradoxically, first there were cracks among the AKP elite, because initially the women who were running a government-approved NGO were not happy about withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention. And there was a whole debate where the president had to choose between very conservative constituencies and women of his party, but that was resolved in the manner I explained. And also now, with the economic crisis and the erosion of the safety nets, I do not know whether the voter base and the women in the voter base are in the same place.
Thank you, Deniz. I'll take one more question before the musical interlude, and the question is by Ashish Praveen. Well, I just saw that there's a second question, so I'll just take these two questions and then we'll stop. So Ashish Praveen is asking, cultural norms on gender have helped the authoritarian governments in the Middle East with serious reservations towards gender equality to rule for long?
That's just it, you see. When we say cultural norms on gender, the norms that the authoritarian governments, that's their real problem. The norms that they are upholding are in many ways no longer valid. Because when you look at younger generations in Turkey and in many other places in the Middle East, the truth is that their aspirations and their lifestyles and so on are in advance, have moved beyond the way in which the governments render culture for their political purposes. In other words, they are having a serious difficulty in reaching out to that youth. And for example, in Turkey, the AKP is very aware of that phenomenon, because poll after poll is suggesting that certainly the Z generation, but even the millennials and the X generation, those who have not known any other form of rule, are way in advance in terms of their marital choices, professional choices, and so on. So when, say, a government like the AKP tells women to stay at home and have 3 children, in reality, there is very little realistic uptake for these policies, not least since things have become so hard. It's become so hard to get the money together to even marry, let alone, you know, that the 2-earner family is becoming a necessity, okay? So I think that the real challenge to these governments is that the sociological realities of their countries are running ahead of them, making it more and more difficult for them to contain a new critical citizenry.
Yeah. Okay, Deniz, thanks so much for your patience. One more question, and you'll have to answer very quickly. So this is by Mahtab Dadasifat Mahbub. Thank you for the talk. My question is about the relationship between queer feminist activist groups and the ruling states in the Middle East. Would you say that the states have the intention, the capacity to fulfill these movements' demands in view of neoliberalism on the rise and non-state actors gaining more power?
This is a very difficult question, because in the in the process of fulfilling aspirations, whatever they may be, some rather horrible things can happen. Look at Iran, for instance. Iran has decided, and I believe Afsaneh Najmabadi wrote about that, has decided to address the question of sex change, okay? And what have they done? They have sponsored sex change operations. At one point, I believe, they were even subsidized. Now, why was that? Because what they could not encounter was any untidiness. So if somebody was gay and wanted to be a male gay and wanted to be with a man, this person had to have a female body. So basically, the sex change operation had turned into a tool for forced castration, essentially. I don't know if you saw these heartbreaking documentaries of Iranian gays that had to undergo sex change operation. The only reason I'm mentioning this is that there's a paradox there, because we have reached a stage where the government cannot ignore the phenomenon, but the way they deal with it can be catastrophic. Okay, so I don't know exactly what I'm saying, but what I'm saying is that governments that are authoritarian will by definition impose a rigid gender order, even under the cover of accommodating non-normative sexualities. I'm sorry, I think this is a very dark answer, but that's all I could think of. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Deniz, for not only very thought-provoking, inspiring keynote, but also taking each question seriously, engaging with it, and providing us with so many insights. Thanks a lot. I'm now going to shift gear and introduce, virtually, because unfortunately can't be with us, but the Palestinian cellist, Faris Amin, has actually recorded a performance, an improvised performance that is inspired by the theme of the conference. So Faris Amin is a cellist, a composer, and music teacher from Palestine. He's in Ramallah. And Faris' passion for music drove him to delve into a vast variety of genres, styles, and settings, from collaborations with musicians, dancers, and actors, to performances with various ensembles and solo recitals. Other than performing classical Arabic music, he improvises and composes music that tells a story through the sound of the cello. Faris completed his bachelor degree in music in Germany in 2019. So I hope you'll enjoy this brief musical interlude. Well, many thanks to Faris for this incredibly moving and beautiful performance. Of course, moments like that, I do wish that we would be together in a physical space. We're going to now take a 2-minute break, and then we will continue with the opening panel. So we'll stay in the same Zoom link, but just give everyone a short break. Thank you very much.
Welcome again, everyone, to the opening panel of our digital conference, Queer Feminist Perspectives on Political Homophobia and Anti-Feminism in the Middle East and Europe, organized by Humboldt University of Berlin, Brown University, and Heinrich Böll Stiftung. For those who are joining us now, my name is Tunay Altay. I'm a PhD researcher in sociology at Humboldt University of Berlin and one of the co-organizers of the conference. I have the great pleasure of moderating today's opening panel with 4 influential figures whose work contributed greatly to the discussion on LGBTQ rights and women's rights, intersectionality and activism, as well as the issues of anti-gender mobilization and the rise of the far right in the Middle East and Europe. I would like to start off by introducing the speakers to you. Please excuse the shorter length of the introductions due to the time limitations. But please, first, I would like to welcome Khalid Abdel-Hadi. Khalid is a visual artist, activist, and founder of My Peli magazine, a Middle East and North Africa-oriented conceptual queer feminist intersectional web scene launched in 2007. Khalid has graduated from several regional and international programs, including the Swedish Institute's Young Leaders Visitors Program, and took part in the Human Rights Watch No Longer Alone campaign and was listed on Guardian's LGBT Change Heroes of 2017. Thanks, Khalid, for joining us today. Next, we have Andrea Pető. Andrea Pető is a historian and a professor at the Department of Gender Studies at Central European University, Vienna, Austria, a research athlete at the Central European University Democracy Institute, Budapest, and a Doctor of Science of the Hungarian Academy of Science. Andrea Pető's research focuses on intellectual and cultural histories of anti-equality movements and parties. Thanks, Andrea, for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Next, we have Anne Phoenix. Anne Phoenix is a professor of psychosocial studies at the Thomas Coram Research Unit, Department of Social Science, University College London, and a fellow of the British Academy and of the Academy of Social Sciences. Anne Phoenix's research is mainly about social identities and the ways in which psychosocial experiences and social processes are linked intersectionally. And her works also includes racialized and gender identities and experiences. Thanks, Anne, for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Finally, we have Alyosxa Tudor. Alyosxa Tudor is the senior lecturer at the Center for Gender Studies at SOAS, University of London. Their work connects trans and queer feminist approaches with transnational feminism and postcolonial studies. Thanks, Alyosxa, for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
So in today's opening panel, we will be thinking through contextual entanglements between research, activism, and art, and visit some of the central issues defining the far right and authoritarian mobilization in Europe and the Middle East. Before we move on, one note for the audience: for those who are attending the event via Zoom, we will save our last 15 minutes for the Q&A as we did for the keynote, so please write down your questions. So without further ado, I would like to turn to our speakers. In our first round of conversation, I want to ask how we make sense of this moment that is by some considered as a rupture, a crisis of democracy, or an exhausted neoliberalism. So first, I would like to turn to Alyosxa with this question. Alyosxa, your work critically engages with the processes of racialization and othering. In one of your recent articles, you define the moment we are in as right-wing times. I would like to hear your take on anti-LGBTQ and anti-feminist mobilization that is disproportionately affecting immigrants, displaced and migrantized people in Europe. What elements of the right-wing marks our current time, and how do you define this right-wing moments or right-wing times? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to the whole organizing team for having me. I'm very excited to be here. Very nice meeting my fellow panel members. So Miriam Ticktin and I used the term right-wing times in a recent article, but I don't claim authorship, right? But what it does to me, I can try to explain what this term does. So to talk about right-wing times allows us to not only talk about the far right and about fascism in this moment, but to talk about a moment that is shaped to such an extent by right-wing ideologies that a lot of the discourse, a lot of things the phenomena that we're experiencing actually are shaped by the right-wing, even if they claim not to be right-wing, right? So we have, for example, transphobic feminists attacking trans people who claim to be on the left. But at the same time, they're using parts of a right-wing discourse and are part of a right-wing discourse, sometimes even going to right-wing. It's, for example, the Heritage Foundation in the US, a very right-wing think tank, had a panel with feminist transphobes called Interventions from the Left. Right. And the question would be, of course, what is still left there if you go to like a very right-wing foundation conference? But at the same time, also, you can claim to be on the left, and maybe we also have to deal with the fact that anti-feminist and anti-LGBTQ and racist ideologies can be found on the left, right? And so the question for me is, with right-wing times, how can we talk about these conjunctures? How can we talk about a moment that makes a specific thinking possible, that makes attacks on the decolonizing, the curriculum movement in the UK possible at the same time as attacks on gender studies, at the same time as the transphobic feminisms that we can see emerging, which is not a new phenomenon, but they're emerging more and more, especially in the UK, as an overlap, as an intersectional thing. So we cannot think only anti-gender attacks without thinking attacks on critical race theory, for example. And so this is what the term does for me. It opens the perspective up.
Thank you, Alyosxa. I mean, in a way, what you describe is also, I mean, this kind of conjunction and the loss of meaning, or what we are describing with when we are referring to left or right. I mean, in Turkey also, the politics is not definitely like running through this diagram, but we have more like a progressive parties versus conservative parties. So when you talk about right-wing times, as you said, or who is left, or who represents left, or who represents right at the moment, this is definitely kind of a challenging time, or a shift might be a good way to put it as well. And I mean, again, this is an interactive format, so if you would like to jump in, please raise your hand. But at this point, I would like to kind of connect this question to something that I read from Phoenix. And in your 2021 keynote, as the Angela Davis guest professor, you also talk about the transformation that we are kind of witnessing, especially in the past year. And you describe this time as the unexpected transformational conjunctions. But your approach to describing this moment is not only the right-wing or authoritarian mobilization, but also the reactions or responses that we are seeing from different activist communities like Black Lives Matter movement or #MeToo. So would you like to tell us more about your kind of perception of this moment of right-wing mobilization?
And I want to start by linking with what Alyosxa has just said, and also what Deniz said, because I think that those are very important. And Alyosxa was talking about conjunctions. And what I think is so important in what they were saying is about the simultaneity of contradictory practices, moments, ideologies, and so on. And this is very much what Deniz was saying in the refusal of binarizing. And I think that these unexpected conjunctions of COVID-19, of the murder of George Floyd, and so the resurgence of Black Lives Matter, and in Britain as well, certainly, the murders of a number of women just walking through parks in the last few months, So the murders of Biba Henry, Nicole Smallman, Sarah Everard, and last week Sabina Nessa, just as examples, these have all shifted understandings of racialization, ethnicization, gender, social class, as well as location. And I think they've contributed towards making Europe so self-evidently less exceptional than it thinks it is in relation to gender, racialization, and sexuality, and so on. And I think they show the impact of positionality. They show that events, disasters, illnesses, and so on are not great equalizers at all. Many people now say we're in the same storms, but not the same boat. And it's become a rather popular phrase. So intersectionality is very much about the social categories to which we belong, but not the whole story. It's showing that social categories are not the whole story. We have to think about relationality. We have to think about power relations, social justice, historical location, timing, so temporality, geography, and space. And I think that thinking about the way in which we're in an anti-feminist and certainly a political homophobic moment makes it all the more important to have an intersectional lens to understand how to oppose the things that are going on at the moment. So, you know, the reality is, for example, that widespread homophobia exists in many societies, but it's marshaled by states, sometimes in implicit ways, to bolster legitimacy and to increase popularity, as well as to distract from pressing social ills. And it can happen insidiously and implicitly by, for example, the way in which heterosexual marriage is valorized, even though gay people can marry, and the way that marriage itself is enshrined in things like benefits and mortgages and so on. But it can also happen, as Michelle Bachelet, I mean, sort of as the UN High Commissioner pointed out, as in electoral or referendum campaigns around the place, you know, sort of that appeal to misogynist, this is to quote her, misogynistic, homophobic or xenophobic sentiments. And why I wanted to quote that is it shows it's intersectional. It's not one thing or another. It's many things that come together in conjunction, in intersection, to produce the contradictions that we're currently living through.
Thanks, Anne. Conjunctions and contradictions, and actually what you referred to in your talk was indispensability of intersectionality. So definitely something, a tool for us to understand the complexities that we are living through. So do you think, are we showing do you think the academia or academics and researchers have a special role in undoing this complexity, or maybe delivering some of the things to the society or general public? How do you see the role of academia here?
Oh, well, that's really interesting, because I'd want to start there from what Gökçe was saying in her introduction. And I should have said that, you know, I very much thank not only Deniz, but the three organizers, including you, for the things that you had to say, because I think that they're very germane, and obviously Alyosxa, who went before me. And one of the things I think about universities is that they've always had within them contradictory currents. And I think we can't say that universities are forces for radical change, or that they're forces for liberal ideas or far-right ideas or whatever, because they contain within them the range of societal notions. And so you get both a stasis and a reproduction of inequities, as well as real shifts and changes, because it's in universities that we produce ideas that will help, that pass into popular discourses, and will also help us to shift ideas, to shift what's accepted as social justice and so on, even in difficult times like the ones that we're going through. And I want to highlight the example from Sara Ahmed, which many of you will know, that in her university, she actually resigned because she just got so fed up with students and other members of staff, you know, coming to her for support around the way that particular men were treating them and harassing them and so on. And the university did nothing. Now, her resignation meant that the university immediately got rid of a couple of people, a couple of men, and so on. But then it immediately began priding itself on being so wonderful that it may have been bad to start with, but now how wonderful it is that it's dealt with it and it's got policies. And it fitted very well with what Sara Ahmed again has talked about as policies as non-performative. And universities reproduce some of the problems that we highlight with an intersectional view. So the reproduction of inequalities in terms of who's there, and who is, as Nirmal Puar says, matter out of place, or sort of also thinking about space invaders. That's Nirmal's view, actually. Matter out of place is much more Grada Quilombo in Germany, and Sara Ahmed again. Who has power in the academy? Who gets grants? What sort of grants get funded, and so on, get reproduced, as well as sometimes there are breakthroughs and different ways of thinking. And yet students have been absolutely vocal about decolonizing the curriculum, about, in my university, UCL, in 2014, they were the first to insist that the Vice-Chancellor equivalent actually held Why Is My Professor White, sort of session, and think about it, and to think about decolonizing, and also to want queer ways of thinking, in other words, ways of thinking about knowledge as non-essentialist, to think differently in both what they're taught and in terms of relations between people. So universities are, I think, wonderful institutions for bringing together new ways of thinking, for enabling this afternoon. We're all privileged to be here, for allowing resistance, the sort of thing that I think Andrea Pető will talk about later. But also, it would be idealized and romanticized and not at all helpful to pretend that they are one thing at all.
Thanks, great point, Anne. And yes, this kind of leads back or connects with Andrea Pető's experience, which is quite interesting. Gökçe also mentioned at the beginning. And now I'm thinking about, Andrea, I introduced you with the old Hungary profile, but now probably your academic bio switched. So, I mean, one of the major attacks, as Gökçe mentioned at the beginning, on gender studies happened in Hungary when Viktor Orbán, the Prime Minister of Hungary, banned gender studies programs at universities, with his deputy arguing the area of study is rather an ideology rather than a science. So, Andrea, would you like to tell us a bit more about what happened in Hungary, and how do you make sense of this attack on gender studies?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really honored to be part of this panel. Can you hear me? Fantastic. Thank you. What happened in Hungary was not unexpected, and it was really not surprising. The government deleted the 2-year MA program in gender studies from the accredited study list. And this has been boiling around for a while, because the liberal regimes are using gender, the concept of gender as they define it, and also gender studies as a kind of alibi in order to create an enemy figure. So that's what we called the gender became a symbolic glue. It glues together different actors, different contradicting claims in order to create the new normal, to redefine what is normal and acceptable. So in that particular context, the Hungarian government drew a line saying it is acceptable to delete a study, an accredited study list from the accredited study from the accredited study list, and it is acceptable that the government is actually intervening into academic matters. And what followed, I think, is more interesting than what happened, because this was somehow, if those who are researching the far-right illiberal movements in the past decade, they knew that this is coming. And what was really surprised that the colleagues were, saying that, you are just paranoia, they will not dare to do this and this will not happen. But of course it did happen. But what followed is really interesting. One, that this kind of attack created what Eric Fassin called the paradoxical recognition. Gender studies became important. Previously, gender studies was really one of these fringe studies, and this kind of attack made gender studies an important field. And I even dare to argue that the new Cold War, what we are experiencing now, and the Cold War is not a reference to the geographical Cold War of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, but rather the process of othering and creating an ideological warfare. So this new Cold War is actually fought on the field of gender studies and the issue of gender equality. So this is one consequence. The second consequence is that those colleagues who have been working in the field of gender studies, they either emigrated, or not only from Hungary, but from Poland and from other countries, but those who did not emigrate, they smoothly switched to family studies. So you see now that the feminist scholars are actually now in Poland, Hungary, sometimes even in Turkey. They are engaged with family studies because the government is supporting heavily the family studies as a field of study, which actually nothing wrong with that. The question is, of course, what do you do in that particular field? And so it will take some time till it will be obvious what will be the outcome of this influx of feminist scholars into the field of family studies, right? And the third consequence I would like to mention is that it actually proved that the resilience or the resistance to these attacks by illiberal forces on gender studies, institutionalized gender education, or scholars, activists in the field of gender studies is very low. So the only reaction, what we see from is the collection of signatures and very, seriously worded manifestos. On the other hand, this is fantastic because it creates the, feeling of community and support and whatever. On the other hand, this is not enough, especially not enough when we see that the different institutions which are expected to safeguard, like the quality assurance of the Hungarian science, like the European Quality Assurance Agency, actually accredited the whole Hungarian accreditation system exactly at the moment when gender studies was deleted. We see that this is actually, and the other institutions which are expected to safeguard, and we believe that in this European context they haven't worked at all. So I think that this is one of the lessons we might actually learn from this, and this kind of discussion what we are having now is a contribution to this, that what kind of innovative, proactive, and kind of possibilities are there to counteract, because what is happening, it's well known in the literature in the past 20 years. The mapping is done. So what shall we do now? I think that's the question. Thank you.
That's a great point, and we will revisit that question at the end of our opening panel. But I want to go back to this concept that you just introduced, this paradoxical recognition, because especially in Turkey's case, this is just what happened with the rainbow flag, for example. I mean, Gökçe mentioned the Boğaziçi protest and how all of a sudden the rainbow flag became the symbol of resistance, and sometimes resistance against an authoritarian regime, AKP, or certain ideology. So we are seeing how at these moments, these difficult times are also creating new possibilities for wider recognition, which has some radical potential, of course, for the future. Speaking of, obviously now, one of our goals with this conference was also broadening the scope of what we understand from universities. And luckily, like having the option to meet via Zoom, we were able to listen to a musician in Palestine, and at the same time, we are opening our doors to activists, academics, and artists who are working on similar subjects. So now I would like to ask the experience of Khalid. Khalid is joining us. Hi, Khalid. So, as a non-academic and at the same time founder and creative director of My Kelly magazine, a magazine that I also publish myself, I know your work is very important, and you've been doing LGBTQ advocacy in Jordan and in the greater Middle East and North Africa region in general. So I'm curious, what's your take on this far-right mobilization, or at the same time, how it is affecting your practice or your work under My Kelly magazine?
So, hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very pleased to be here. I would like to re-highlight the fact that I'm not an academic. So forgive me if I lack some communication skills in that sort. In terms of how the pandemic affected our work, it actually, for our experience with being a digital entity was one of our main goals or main identity values right at the beginning, right from the get-go. And then the whole craze about having like a digital identity and having this thing of creating this virtual world, which is much more amplified during the COVID, happened during that period of time. In our scenario specifically, we started to realize the increase of gender-based violence and the increase of queer people being subjected to domestic violence, specifically that everybody is now having to be reinforced being at home. Unfortunately, these are some of the cases that we had to see across the MENA region. Of course, we understand this happens all over the world, but our focus and our attention is usually, or my perspective is usually from the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa. That's one thing. Second, creating virtual worlds like digital parties, which you have contributed to in an article about digital clubbing, or the concept of digital clubbing in Turkey, and how that sort of opened the door for us to actually having more and more collaborations, thanks to your article. With our publication, we start to realize that actually the gap in queer inclusive spaces physically in the region, and we believe that this sort of movement of having these digital events will continue on to even if COVID hopefully subsides and everything goes back to normal. We believe it sort of introduced us all to a new experience, a virtual experience that is more inclusive, that could be not as inclusive or less intimidating than physical spaces in that sort. Another aspect is we started to realize how governments in general took advantage of COVID to actually control more people, more citizens, and that includes queer and women people, and having such control. I can give you a couple of examples. In Jordan specifically, to give you a context, being LGBT is not criminalized, but it's not legal at the same time. That means that the government does not even recognize being an LGBT person. There would be people who would be hosting certain house parties here and there, and then you would see police parading in, arresting people in the name of hosting parties during the COVID, but it was actually, in fact, it was because of having these LGBT or queer parties specifically in the name of COVID, and how the media depicts it, about how the police or the government would tackle down these spaces in the name of COVID, but then they would reiterate it as the police crack down on LGBT parties in Jordan, which is not illegal to begin with, to report on. Does that make sense? So it's just parading and muscle flexing of the government using COVID as a main purpose to crack down on these events. Thank you.
Thanks, Khalid. And if I remember correctly, your magazine, I mean, you can also tell maybe a little bit about the magazine and its goal and its purpose, but if I remember it correctly, there was this issue with the Jordanian media and you were being targeted by some political groups during the election campaigns, I believe. Would you like to tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, so that is like two phases. So to give you context, the publication started in 2007, and we started in English as a mechanism to protect ourselves from being mainstream or to be targeted by the media or the government, because the main language spoken in our country and in the region is Arabic, and we feel if we were too much exposed using that language, it would actually jeopardize our stay or our work. So after 7 years of working with exclusively English, we started to get into Arabic language, and then we had an anticipation of if we ever go public in Arabic, we will face a certain level of controversy, but we didn't expect it that it's going to be this amount, and how the sensationalist media, of course, we understand that there's difference in sort of types of media, you know, there's the mainstream media, the governmental media, and the alternative media. I'm talking about specifically clickbaiting and a sensationalist type of media, where once we published the first Arabic issue, there was a huge controversy about, or lies spreading specifically from these outlets, saying that we are registered, licensed, and there's prints, and pointing fingers towards the government, specifically the Media Commission in Jordan, about how can such publication exist in the Kingdom of Jordan, which the principal of the Media Commission at the time had to respond by saying, we checked our systems, this publication does not exist. Of course, using the format of Jordan is a traditional Muslim countries that abide by customs and tradition, and we will not allow or accept for this publication to be registered or licensed under our supervision. And if there's going to be any prints, there will be lawsuits. And of course, at the end, if I recall well, the principal mentioned that he basically debunked everything that was saying in the media, saying, we urge the media, if you want to write about something related to this matter, please come back to us because what you wrote is unfactual. By saying that, on the same day, they blocked the publication in Jordan, even though they know that there is no fact or truth to whatever was being spread. So we were also subjected to that kind of censorship. Now, to put you in context, in Jordan, I don't know if you were aware, but at the same time, 2 months prior to this situation, there was a Lebanese band who came to perform in Jordan, and they were banned from performing due to the sole fact that their artwork resembled something related to Satanicism, but it has nothing to do with that. It was like mostly like an artwork of people wearing animal masks in their like album Identity, and then the Christian party in the parliament had to request for this ban to be blocked. And then the international media started to speak about Jordan's freedom of expression in a more international kind of scope. And then during the time we were blocked, we were going through our own dilemma with the government. So we were bombarded by the international media wanting to comment on this matter. So if we announced that we were blocked, we would be targeted as well by the government using the international media to embarrass them. So we decided not to mention anything. So that's phase one. Pause on that, moving fast forward to 2017, where the parliament member that you were just mentioning did an interview with an international TV station, which the presenter provoked her to talk about homosexuality, which she did negatively, knowing her point of views about homosexuality or LGBT. And of course, she was trolled online, and she was provoked to speak about it on Twitter, which we went into this kind of back and forth debate online. And then we learned later that she went to the Media Commission to ask for the publication to be blocked. And then we were confused because we were already censored. How is she trying to censor something that is already censored? We did not make sense to that sort of situation. But to our surprise, the media started to paint her as the person behind the blockage. And we started to realize that she's using it to gain more visibility to her, how do you say, like credit, so she can re-elect herself and to have more accomplishments under her belt, to say like, I am the virtue of this country, please vote for me. I was the reason to block queer publications like my Khalid. Yeah. So we, to that, we, with our team members and the activist community members in Jordan, we have created an open letter to adjust all of that. In a nutshell, saying you are not the reason behind this, and voila.
Thanks, Khalid, for sharing. This is very interesting. It is just, seeing how like politicians are using, probably with a certain populist idea, like aiming at this like underrepresented communities to gain some sort of popularity in their like conservative electorate. So it's quite interesting, and I really see parallels between the anti-gender mobilization and what you just described in Jordan's case, because obviously my Khalid represents a visible group that is openly queer and LGBTQ. So targeting a group like that is easy for politicians, and especially if they want to prove their kind of heteronormative nationalism and maybe gain some electorates. You also mentioned COVID-19. I was hoping to ask more about COVID-19 actually to Alyosxa. So Alyosxa, I was really amazed reading your article with Miriam Tiktin. I think it's brilliant. And you speak about the impacts of COVID-19 on laying bare the intersectional vulnerabilities that are entrenched in our society. This is also an open question for others as well, but would you like to tell us a bit more about how you see COVID-19 as a crisis that affected minority rights and nationalism, and especially within the conjuncture, as Anne and Andrea described before?
Thank you. Yeah, I think there are many levels to this and many layers. And I think one layer we can see is like, for example, the nationalism, the methodological nationalism we could see in the beginning of when the West was hit by the first wave of COVID. It seemed that they were so surprised because what happened somewhere else was not important enough to make transnational analysis, right? And so basically, a lot of countries were hit by surprise because what happened before was not real because it happened somewhere else. And I think that is really important. But then also, of course, a lot of reactions were really, really nationalist. So basically home was defined again in the terms of the nation states, which excluded migrants, which excluded people like not having homes because not having citizenship, not having homes because not having somewhere to live. And migrants were called like seasonal workers, for example, in the overlap of these problems of like sheltering in the household, sheltering in your own home. You have to have a home first and you have to be a recognized citizen. At the same time, I think what is really important is also to see the crackdown on fields of knowledge that happened during the last year and a half. And so we can see that in various examples, looking at the UK, for example, you have, for example, there was in the beginning, the government came in with an emergency package that was proposed to universities. Ironically, later the universities didn't need to take these emergency packages because what people wanted to do in the pandemic was studying, right? So actually, universities didn't have problems to get the students in, even though it was everything online, right? But in the beginning, that was not, the government did not know that. And so there was this package and it had three things the universities would have needed to fulfill in order to get the emergency funds. And that was getting rid of economically less promising degrees, right? So it's like, getting rid of the humanities, of course, that's lingering here in the back. Then the second point was taking away funds from student groups that do not serve the majority of students, right? And so you can see here how LGBT groups, how anti-racist groups and so on would be defunded by that proposal. And the last point was the government gets to dictate what will be taught in these universities that take the package. And I thought when that came up, really, this is like we're seeing here one of the many endings of democracy, of course, right? One of the many endings, because I think we're in the ending, you know, the ending, we don't know when it started and we don't know how many endings there will be, but I think that became really clear. And then we had like this moving on later, we had Kemi Badenoch, the Tory Minister for Equalities, attacking critical race theory suddenly, right? In the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of the Black Lives Matters movements that have come up worldwide, right? You have the Tory Equality Minister attacking critical race theory as not being democratic. And I think you see here also the phantasmatic nature, because like it's hardly that critical race theory is like taught widely in the UK at schools, right? So that it could be a danger to who would be the question. And then we had at the same time a billionaire, J.K. Rowling, right, the Harry Potter author, suddenly coming out. It was not suddenly, she had done that before, but of course she did that in the middle of the Black Lives Matter protests, in the middle of a pandemic that cost the lives of so many people, mostly of Black and brown people in the UK and in the US. And so there were massive racist inequalities. She has nothing else to do than to say trans women, trans people are a danger to women, right? Which is completely phantasmatic. It is made up. But what it does, of course, it cracks down both on gender studies, right? So because gender studies is seen as the ideology that is taught in university that takes away, that's the brainwashing program that takes away the stable categories of men and women. But it also cracks down, of course, in the moment we have like a global health crisis on the access to health for trans people. Right, and you could see that in the US as well. You could see that in the UK, that the Gender Recognition Act was paused in the moment in which healthcare is even more important than in previous moments. And also, I think we can see here that the government and all these actors involved in these kind of distractions, which I would call distractions, thought that people would be so, taken by the struggle of surviving the pandemic and surviving and getting along on an everyday basis, that they would not notice that these things happen and then that there would be no resistance. And so that's why I think we have to think these things together. So the attacks on gendered minorities, especially trans and non-binary people, the attacks on women, if they're trans or not, the attacks on migrants and the attacks on Black and brown people within the Western nation state all go together. And for the future, just hinting, it is very, very important to think about solidarities that do not throw others under the bus. So because I think these kind of strategies of like, oh, well, I'm not that kind of gender studies scholar, I'm an empiricist, I work with real men and women, right? We've seen these strategies are really, really harmful. And I think it's very important not to try to make oneself into the anti-racist, into the trans activist who is not as pervert, into the feminist who is not as pervert. Because in the end, we will be all seen as perverts and we need to work together to defend everybody in our communities.
Thanks, Alyosxa, great point. And I really like your formulation of this future that we build as a collective of perverts and trying to fight against these oppressive systems and governments. I mean, I'm especially struck by this, like the way that you describe the phantasmatic nature of how gender studies departments or LGBTQ or trans rights are being represented by the right-wing media, or the political capital of actually of anti-gender or anti-LGBTQ mobilization that is in Jordan, that is in Turkey, that is in the UK. And that's why exactly maybe that capital that people are aiming, especially populist leaders or populist figures are aiming for when they are attacking this underrepresented groups. One point that you also said, one of the many endings of democracy. So we only have 10 minutes left. I wanna move on to questions because we received some really interesting questions as well. But one final word about the future, because I mean, talking about endings, obviously we are also imagining futures. So when we are at this moment of one of the many endings of democracy, if you would call it, as Alyosxa did. So what do we think about the future? So you already mentioned, you already gave some comments about it, Alyosxa. Maybe here, Andrea, Pető, if you would like to comment, because in one of your interviews, I saw that you said, and I quote, "I'm writing books which are connected to the future and based on the past." So it was a quite, I mean, it got my attention. So if you would like to maybe say a few words about the future.
Thank you. I believe that there are so many interesting ways to talk about the future. And what I learned in the previous years working, living, struggling in a liberal state is that the only way to meaningfully counteract the liberal regime is to ignore it and stop complaining, maybe even stop reacting to what they are doing and what kind of actions they are imposing, and try to think creatively about the issues which are important for us. So the question is from where the change will be coming, and the change will be coming from us, from these individuals who are ready to go out to the street, who are writing interesting books, who are editing fantastic digital journals like Khalid is doing. So I mean, the change is starting with the individuals and with the intellectuals. So one of the lessons I learned from the fight against this illiberal regime is that this reactive character of the feminist analysis is really harmful. So therefore, I thought that I'm not a typical historian who is very much interested in the past. I'm interested in the future. So I'm interested in the future to understand what is coming. And we don't really have got anything else to project and to think about the future, but our experiences and what we have already experienced and survived. And this is not the first time when there is a big dark cloud is on the horizon. This is a part of the European modernity. There are constantly waves when these dark forces, the bitter legacies or the dark forces are actually trying to create another version of modernity. But I believe that, my optimism is based on what I see in Hungary today. The primaries of the opposition had been organized in the previous 3 days for selecting who will be the opponent to the Orban government. And no matter that the whole election process was hacked by unidentified forces, I see that people are actually queuing on the streets for voting. And what can academics do? Academics can write interesting books which are read by a lot of people. And this is also connected to the knowledge production, what Anne was already mentioning. So universities should stop valuing peer-reviewed articles which are published in horribly expensive commercial publishing houses and read by 23 people. So this is also a way of opening up the gates. So the change will only happen if the whole knowledge production is changing, and academia will not be only focusing on this very close circles. And I know this is a long debate in gender studies itself. So there are scholars who believe that gender studies should become just a proper discipline like brain science or whatever. And there are others who are basically saying that gender studies will never be just another discipline like engineering or whatever. So it's I think that those who decided to work in gender studies, they have a vision of the future. So I just would like to encourage us to believe in that future and to hope that there will be a change, and this change depends on us, and the change is actually happening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrea. this beautiful closing remarks. Now I will open the floor for the questions. Our listeners, please use the Q&A function. We already received 4 questions. We have 5 minutes left. Unfortunately, maybe we can ask for a 5-minute extension to answer more questions. I will start with a question from Hassan Kilani. Hassan says, as a Jordanian activist and reader of My Kelly magazine, would Khalid able to elaborate on how this platform provides knowledge from lived experiences in MENA region rather than academic Western knowledge? Also, does the magazine provide something alternative from the Western liberal discourse in the Middle East?
Thank you, Hassan, for the question. I believe knowledge production and that is produced by the not only the activist community, but the storytelling and the documentation of the queer and the feminist community in the region is one of the ways to move forward from Western imposed narratives and context towards telling the story of queer people or feminists, because it does differ. This context is different than that context naturally. So I think using storytelling, knowledge production, and using such platforms to empower people using their own voices as a platform is a way to go. Another way is, we were talking earlier about the future. I think one of the ways to go forward is to actually redefine the past, because many of us, we've been denied acceptance and acknowledgement in the past, and many of these stories were buried down, were unaccessible, unrecognized. And I think redefining it and using it as resources and putting it out there, which helps us almost build a different future using these resources and stories, is a way to also look forward. And that also depends on how we use these resources, in which definition and towards what context. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Khalid. Our next question is from Sidar Tekin. You talked about the queer flag as becoming a radical symbol during Boğaziçi protests in Turkey, and I agree that its criminalization does play a significant role in embracing the flag more by queers and queer allies, and it becomes a huge topic of protest and fight with police regarding bridging the flag to the protest areas. However, considering Sarah Ahmed's conception of sticky objects, the queer flag also becomes a sticky object. That means it may lose its historicity and meaning due to its enormous circulation in media and everyday life with various implications. What do you think about it? And you mentioned Sarah Ahmed previously. Would you like to respond to this question, or maybe we can all think about it together?
I think that, well, Andrea should answer this as well, certainly, it being about Turkey. But I think that things becoming sticky objects, it doesn't mean that they necessarily lose meaning. I mean, meanings are forever shifting and changing. And the way that they keep radical meanings and so on depends on what's put into them in terms of political action and activity. So I think the resistance is quite crucially important for the meaning of any symbol to be maintained, or if it's not maintained, then there are people who will shift the symbols that they use because it matters a great deal what the content is. So I think that it's more complicated than simply the government will does something and you know, the meaning shift or whatever. But since it's about Turkey, Andrea, I'm sure will have something to say.
Thank you. Although my experience and knowledge about Turkey is limited, but I just would like to say that this paradoxical recognition is actually contributed to a very widespread acknowledgement of gender studies and gender equality values. I would rather say that it's even contributed to the best way of gender mainstreaming. And I would like to tell you a story of resistance, which I think might be useful and slightly encouraging and for the future Yes.
Andrea, just only maybe 1 minute, if you can keep this to show
30 seconds. 30
right.
seconds. The solidarity protest supporting the CEU because of the ban of gender studies was organized by 3 universities. This was an active strike, because strike, of course, is controlled and labeled illegal by the liberal state. And the active strike was that on these 3 universities, the faculty members were teaching the same course for the same students, the same curriculum, but the gender component of that particular topic. So it shows that these scholars already knew that there is gender studies. They knew these books, they knew the authors, but they haven't really bothered to use them. And because of the attacks, they incorporated the gender element into the course. So thanks to the liberal government, our allies or comrades who previously were saying, gender studies. Now they recognize that fighting for gender equality and inclusion is actually a question of life and death for the future of democracy. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. So we are almost done with our time. And do you have any comments? And would you like to add any comments about the future while we are ending the panel?
Well, I think that it's very interesting. I'm not an historian, and I think that one of the things that's so fascinating about thinking about the future is that the haunting of the past becomes absolutely key, and that we've seen that so much with these what I call the unexpected conjunctions of COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, what could be called #MeToo. I think there's more in it than that. And, thinking about the way in which homophobia has proliferated and so on. And one of the things is that the exhaustion that has come from people putting up with things that are taken for granted, oppressions in the past, has meant that various things have burst out. So not surprisingly, with Black Lives Matter, that resurgence came about because so many people are so fed up. They really want change. So in other words, the past haunting the present leads to a different imagining of the future and a resistance that means that the future is crafted in a different way, and that the understanding of the past also changes. And I think you can see that has all sorts of issues, that haunting of the past in terms of how people behave in the present, who they trust, who they don't trust, but is crucially important for thinking about the future. And I think I agree with everything that Alyosxa said and Andrea about the importance of thinking about the future and needing solidarities, I think Alyosxa said. But I also want to, in thinking about hopefully and wanting to craft new futures, bearing in mind what Laurent Ballant said about cruel optimism, and that those solidarities have to be really thought through. It has to be based on solidarities and a vision of the future. And I particularly wanted to mention Laurent Ballant, since she just recently died, and I think that her work is so interesting. But we can so easily reproduce the maintenance of the status quo in the future unless those solidarities are both well thought through and that we realize that they have to be shifting. One of the things about intersectionality is we cannot, say that we will ally with people for all time, because, we have to ally across issues. So like gender, against anti-feminism, against homophobia, against racism, and so on, for particular reasons, and not continue alliances when we see that they don't work, they don't lead towards the future that we want.
Thank you so much, Anne, for this beautiful closing remarks. So this is the end of our opening discussion. It was a pleasure to host you today, Andrea, Pető, Alyosxa, Tudor, and Phoenix, Khalid, Abdel-Hadi. Thank you for joining this session. I hope you will be also able to attend some of the panels in the upcoming 2 days. It was a pleasure. Thank you again for joining. Thanks to the audience as well for your questions. Hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.
And thank you, Tunay. You've been a wonderful guest. So good.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
To the other panelists, thank you.